Welcome to Wisconsin in Focus. I'm J.D. Davidson. Election officials in Racine used a van as a mobile voting location in the 2022 primary election. That gave concern to Republicans that it created an advantage for Democrats in that primary. The issue went before the Wisconsin Supreme Court earlier this week. And joining us today is Ben Yount, Wisconsin contributor for the Center Square. Ben, what are the arguments raised about the mobile voting location? And what does the court have to decide?
Yeah, there are really two parallel cases here. One is the easy case. Does Wisconsin law allow for the mobile voting unit? Now, we've called it a mobile voting van because alliteration sounds better. Voting van as opposed to voting RV.
I hate to interrupt, but do you remember back in elementary, when you grew up, did you have the bookmobile?
Yes, we did.
This is what I picture when I see that.
If you remember the movie Stripes, this is pretty much the exact same vehicle. It's like an RV. It is big and it goes, and it's a place where people can go inside and actually cast a ballot. It also picks up absentee ballots from other locations. So this is not just some sort of city work van that has ballots written on the side in spray paint going location to location and letting people vote. But the state law is clear. Nothing in state law says you are allowed to use a mobile voting van in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, state law is pretty specific and talks about public buildings. Now, there is a little wiggle room because, of course, there is. This is Wisconsin and it's an election story that you talk about polling or absentee voting sites as opposed to polling places in public buildings. And the people who are arguing in favor of the van are trying to say that a site is different than a polling place, and so the requirements are different. But while you have the conversation about the mobile voting van itself, most of the argument, most of what the Wisconsin Supreme Court was taking a look at was who can sue. And the person suing here, this is Brown versus the Wisconsin Elections Commission. The Brown in this case was the head of the Racine County Republican Party, a guy by the name of Ken Brown. And he didn't like this strategy from the Democratic city clerk of Racine. So he filed an objection before the Wisconsin Elections Commission. The Elections Commission said, no, this is fine. It's not technically illegal. So I guess it's okay. A Racine County judge earlier in the year said, no, the Elections Commission is wrong. Nothing in law says you can do this. And now the case is fast-tracked to the Supreme Court. And that question of who gets to sue is really crucial here because there is an opportunity to, before the November election perhaps, rule on this case without having to rule on whether mobile voting vans are legal. I've got a little bit of tape from the argument, and this shows how into the weeds and where the liberal majority court's mind is when they're talking about standing. Who gets to sue and what do they get to sue over? And does anybody just get to sue over any election issue? Because the way that state law reads right now is, yeah, any voter can file a claim against their local election, and that could work its way all the way through. This is Justice Jill Karofsky and the lawyer for the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, Lucas Weber. He's arguing against the idea of the mobile voting van and for the idea that you don't have to find the one voter who was hurt by this mobile voting van in order to challenge the idea of using a mobile voting van.
It imagines a voter who mistakenly believes that state law requires elections officials to throw away all ballots that includes votes for a particular party. So it's taking this to perhaps an extreme example, yes? Sure. While the belief is patently inaccurate, there's no doubt that the belief would allow the voter to file a complaint under 5.06 sub 1. So under your view, even in this, I would agree it's an extreme example. Even there, if that person lost in front of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, they would be aggrieved and they could file their lawsuit in circuit court.
Yes, Your Honor, I do believe they would. I think the special proceeding that's created by Sub 8 to review WEC's decisions would allow for that. I think there are other things that would come into play there. I mean, frivolous lawsuits get filed all the time and would be subject to, other penalties, I suppose, and ethics rules there. So if frivolous complaints were being filed and frivolous complaints were being brought in circuit court, presumably there'd be other remedies. Presuming, of course, that this would be a frivolous argument they're making on the extreme. So, but I do think that Section 8 would allow any party. It simply says the aggrieved party, and I think in that context, it just means whichever party loses before WEC.
Yeah, that's riveting back and forth. Now, if you're a lawyer, this is a case study in how to argue and how to answer questions on the fly. But that's where an awful lot of this conversation is. And it's important for one thing, that if the Wisconsin Supreme Court can dodge, can avoid, can rule in this case without having to say thumbs up or thumbs down to things like mobile voting vans, that gives local election managers, and we've got almost 2,000 of them in the state, some wiggle room, some freedom. And that has been part of the strategy from Democratic election managers. We're talking local clerks, as well as Democratic Party operatives. They want there to be as much wiggle room in Wisconsin election law as possible. And so the key here is, will the liberal majority Wisconsin Supreme Court decide the case once and for all, bing, bang, boom? Or will they find an opportunity to decide this case without deciding the broader issue?
So, correct me if I'm wrong, though. If they skip over the broader issue and it leaves that wiggle room for county election managers to make that decision on their own on whether they want to have a mobile voting option in their county, Republican county managers in Republican-dominated counties have the same ability, right?
You're exactly right. They absolutely do. They won't use it. We've seen this with ballot drop boxes, that the same liberal majority Supreme Court said, look, there's nothing in state law that says ballot drop boxes are legal, but there's also nothing in state law that says ballot drop boxes are illegal. And so because we embrace the idea that there should be as few restrictions on voting as possible, we're going to allow them. And you've had a handful of communities, including the community that I live in, vote to say, no, we're not going to use. We have such faith. We do not trust election drop boxes, and we're not going to use them. To which many people have pointed out, you're not hurting Democrats in Madison by doing that. You're only hurting your Republican voting base. But look, this is Wisconsin, and we are still in many ways litigating the 2020 election. I mean, this case specifically is from 2022. But the idea that something happened in 2020 continues to reverberate throughout every election here in Wisconsin. And so, no, you're exactly right. The rules would be the rules for everyone. It's just that many Republicans in Wisconsin, many conservatives, many lawmakers don't want any wiggle room. They want the law to be the law when it comes to elections. And here we are with another case that could leave a little room for interpretation, a little room for local flavor, that they'll do it differently in Madison than they'll do it in Jefferson, that they'll do it differently in Rhinelander than they'll do it in La Crosse. And it all depends on how you look at whether that's a good thing for election laws or a bad thing for election laws. And that really does come down to, are you on the R side or the D side?
This is interesting. And this is one of those cases that nobody's going to pay much attention to that could have a huge impact in November. Ben, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.